Sort of a description of your research related to the environmental impacts here in the Pacific Northwest from activities in China and the conclusions you can draw from it.
Sure. So, Davis, what we've been doing is sampling particles in the atmosphere, and these are things like dust and smoke, and trying to understand where they come from and then what their impacts are. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we've had some limited research. Back in 2001, we did some work at Crater Lake, and again in 2002, we did some sampling there. We've also looked at some long-term trends from a National Park Service network that's set up throughout the United States. There's also a sampling site at Crater Lake, and then up in the Olympic Peninsula, doing long-term sampling and analysis. And essentially what we do is we analyze these particles, fingerprint them, and figure out where they come from, and then try and determine the climate impacts or the air quality impacts from those. And what the research shows is for background air, that up to 2/3 of the background air comes from across the Pacific. I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is a lot of pollution, but if you're trying to achieve natural conditions in any environment, you have to think about the pollution that comes from across your border. And so I think that's an important thing, not only for the Pacific Northwest, but of course for all of the United States. Our work most recently has been focused in California, largely because as a scientist, you have to get funding, and that's where the funding has come from. We're very interested in looking at the impacts on our water systems from this pollution, and that's the climate link. So the climate link is if you produce, or if you use energy, you produce pollution. And the pollution mostly that we've been talking about today are greenhouse gases. But in addition to that, you produce these particles, and those are laden with lots of other types of materials, metals like mercury, which can deposit into streams and rivers and lakes, and black carbon. These are basically it's soot. And so soot can act similar to a greenhouse gas in that it absorbs radiation and it changes the radiation balance of the atmosphere, so it has a similar effect. Whereas other things like sulfate can actually reflect radiation. So there's a significant direct climate impact from this pollution. And then there's the indirect climate impact that comes from how clouds form and the other types of climatic changes that result from pollution in the atmosphere. So our work is really focused on these short-lived species in the atmosphere, the things like dust and smoke that I mentioned, and not so much the greenhouse gas part of it, but those are associated with the use of energy.
So how is your work being leveraged, into the global community, or, what is the impact of your work? Where does your work manifest itself in either in policy or, what's the goal?
Sure. As a scientist, typically speaking, you do your science and you write papers, and it's focused on a pretty small community. This particular topic has, for whatever reason, been something of interest in the media. And so as a result of that, this kind of media story that pollution can be transported across the Pacific on the prevailing westerly winds, that has actually caused a lot of discussion about what types of controls need to be put in place and how that affects air here in the United States, in the Pacific Northwest, and in California is where the discussion's been focused most recently. And this isn't, of course, only my work. Lots of researchers have contributed to this work, and it's an important body of research that shows that we live in a global community. That's sort of obvious from the greenhouse gas perspective, but wasn't so obvious from the perspective of what were considered air quality pollutants, that you actually can have a climatic impact not only from the greenhouse gas emissions, but the other types of controls that we have on our emissions here in the United States are not necessarily in other developing countries. And in China, although, as Mark showed, their energy use hasn't grown as quickly as their GDP, in fact, quite a bit slower than their GDP, which is very encouraging. There are other environmental issues that are associated with that energy use. that don't have the same level of control as you would find in a developed country. And so that's the type of discussion that's happening now in the policy world, is how do you put those controls on and still maintain a viable economy?
Good. So this question is for Lonnie and Bob, is in your eyes, what are some of the impediments or barriers that you've experienced in working in China in the areas of energy efficiency, or getting people to adopt or educate, or through your experience in what you do relative to energy efficiency?
So the only real barrier, and it's actually kind of a funny